Hopefully you can ignore the stomping upstairs and the dogs barking. Yeah, let's just get back into the video though. The human religion is the last metamorphosis of the Christian religion. For liberalism is a religion because it separates my essence from me and sets it above me, because it exalts the man to the same extent that any other religion does its god or idol, because it makes what is mine into something otherworldly, because it, in general, makes out what is mine, out of my qualities and my property, something alien, to wit, in essence, in short, because it sets beneath man, and therefore creates me a vocation. Max Stirner, 1844. Now, two YouTube channels that I highly recommend if you haven't heard of them, and given the fact that most of you are subscribed from Skeptical Heretic, you probably have heard of them, or at least I hope you have, and that's Cardinal Virtue and Cobra Jones. Today I'd like to have a discussion over the topic of several of their select videos, or the topic of several of their select videos. I won't necessarily be addressing what they said per se, but I'm going to throw my 2 cents into several of the things they've been talking about essentially. I'm going to be reading from this reading from this laptop because I've got a lot to say, yeah, and I'd like to be concise, but yeah. Now, CJ in particular posted a video on healthcare as a human right and why we shouldn't consider it, and I'll link that into the description below. And Rob touched upon this in the past on blog TV sessions and in other videos, though I couldn't find any particular videos of his talking about human rights. Might have been on his other channels, I don't know. Could not find them though. Hopefully you know his opinion on human rights, that it's a silly concept. But I like to throw my own 2 cents in there. However, another topic that the Cardinal Virtues has talked about in plenty of his videos is the topic of proactive anti-theist atheists. And this too relates to what I'd like to talk about today, which is the topic of humanism. Because, by chance, I think that the idea that human rights is often associated with these atheists and mainstream liberalism in the form of humanism, I think that you can really talk about these two subjects relating, the idea of human rights and the values of these atheists. And I am an atheist, by the way. I just think that these kind of atheists, these proactive, pretty much religious atheists, are sacks of shit, to say the least. Now, this, of course, begs the question of what is humanism, and while humanism is a ranging school of ideology that is largely vague, for the purpose of this video, humanism is a belief system that derives values from human universals rather than from spirituality and religion. Of prime importance is the focus on human nature, in that most humanists believe either that humans are inherently good, or in the case of secular humanists, that basically humans have an ethical responsibility to act in a particular manner that best associates what is fit for human essence. You see this in, like, for example, Carl Sagan's philosophy, or Richard Dawkins, where they have this kind of cosmopolitan belief of humanity, that we have this kind of responsibility to be above and beyond the other life, you know, in the world, essentially. And so I like to throw my own 2 cents in from a more anti-humanist perspective, which is really it's an unfortunate name, but anti-humanist, you should look into that school of philosophy. Now, it is my belief, as it was Stirner's and as it was Friedrich Nietzsche's, or Nietzsche's, however you want to say it, that humanism replaces the worship of God with the worship of man. But rather than worship the human subject, like you and me as individuals, it dismisses the identity, only concerning itself rather with the essence of human being. For example, I, as catastrophe fix, have no value other than the fact that I am a human, essentially. That the value that the core value that we need to talk about is the essence of what makes me a human rather than me as an individual. So it replaces individual identity with collective identity, and that's largely a bad thing in my opinion. A collectivist identity, or a cosmopolitan identity, where we believe ourselves to be one, mega species, is farcical to say the least. Yes, in biological terms we are one species, but there exists no one people. There are just many persons with many cultures and many different values. When you try to make these claims that we all have these same universal beliefs, what you're in essence doing is ascribing these personal beliefs that you have on the rest of the world. And it's often Western society that does this. We proclaim to be basically moral superiors to the rest of the world, and we say that all humans share these common beliefs of democracy and freedom and justice, which really is not necessarily true. Because there really isn't a fixed human static identity, to say the least. Like I said, humanists tend to believe that humans are innately good, but I think that with sociopaths and other people who just in general are evil, that there's no evidence that at the core of every human being, there are the same belief systems. Sure, there are instincts that we all share, but we don't all have any kind of goodness at the bottom of our heart. We're all our own individual people, essentially. Now, I'd like to talk about what CJ said in particular in regards to human rights, and I'm going to break this video up into, first of all, what CJ said with human rights, and then I'm going to talk about what Rob said, cardinal virtues, with the beliefs and the values of these humanists, essentially. Now, it appears that CJ's main video, point of his video, which I talked about earlier, and I'll have the link in the description below, is that rights are based off of sovereignty rather than the idea of natural rights or human rights, and that they don't exist in a vacuum, essentially. And if natural rights were to exist, that these rights would be pretty much for any action: the right to kill, the right to steal, the right to defend yourself, and the right to die. So any kind of talking about social, if you're going to talk about society, you have to talk about in terms of sovereignty rather than in terms of human rights. I'm going to pull off my rings because I know I was fiddling with them in the last video. But yeah. So when you talk about things, for example, like guaranteeing the rights of people in South Sudan, you have to understand that either you have to have some sort of sovereign state, or you have to have some sort of artificial actor like a military policing the area to ensure that their human rights aren't being violated, that genocides aren't happening. And while I'm not saying that we shouldn't intervene in the world, because I think that we do need to stop atrocities, what I'm saying, and what I'll end up saying in my conclusion, is that we shouldn't have to do this with some sort of sense of moral superiority, because that often makes it so that way we can dismiss the own atrocities that we commit against our own people and against, people like the Iraqis, for example. Now, when people cite human rights, they often call upon vague, abstract concepts like freedom and justice and even the quality of life. But what they don't understand is that these constructs are largely a mirage. It's in my opinion that when we globalize values like human rights, freedoms, culture, democracy, that it actually leads to the devaluation of these very concepts as rights. These so-called universals primarily stem from Western thought, as I previously stated. And this is shown in Western society as it tries to mass produce and export these ideas to third world countries. We've seen this most recently with, basically like Libya, for example, where we've been trying to thrust upon our democratic values when they have to develop their own, form of governments. And it might be a democracy, yes, but it's not going to be the same democracy that we have. And when we try to push our sovereign beliefs on them, that's not going to go over very well because they are culturally different than us. And so, given that our own government isn't very functional, I can't understand how anybody can imagine that a nation that's basically been ruled over by a dictator or a king for the past 20 or so years is going to have any more luck than we will. And that's proven in Afghanistan and Iraq for the past 5 years. Sure, there have been functioning times when their democracies have worked, but all in all, the people weren't exactly ready when we just took out, Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Not to say that we shouldn't have done that. There are justifications for that, but my point remains the same, that they weren't exactly quite ready. The people have to be ready to be freed before you can actually free them. And it goes back to this idea of us trying to basically globalize our own personal beliefs. Now, one theory in anthropology is dependency theory, which would essentially indicate that there's this old belief that nations develop in the very same manner that basically Africa is developing where the United States was developing 200 years ago, or that Middle Eastern countries are on their way to be developing like Europe or whatever, or China is going to be just like the United States, when that's not true. As I said, different cultures basically breed different development. So while all these nations might be developing, they're going to develop in their own way. And when we try to categorize them and try to say that they're just going to be, progressing towards the standards that the United States has, that basically, in 1,000 years that Africa is going to be exactly like the United States, I think we often ignore the fact that we are exploiting these nations for their resources and minerals, which we've been doing for the past, several centuries, essentially. And this is problematic because when you try to actually foster this kind of universal beliefs, which tend to be Western values, in these kind of third world nations, the other half of the world, so to speak, you kind of create a degree of cultural conflict. For example, Osama bin Laden played on this kind of anti-Western sentiment by both talking about the military endeavors of the United States, but also the institution of Western values in the Middle East with the creation of the State of Israel. Basically, what we see is that they take this perceived imperialism and use it to basically, recruit new terrorists to attack the United States. It kind of leads to the undoing of Western society when we try to engage in these imperialist endeavors. But yeah. But going on past what CJ was talking about, the idea of sovereignty, sovereign rights, I'd like to talk about what Cardinal, Virtues, whatever, Federalist Films, whatever he's going by these days, talked about, which was these atheists essentially. And to me, they are humanistic in their beliefs. For example, he points out the fact that a lot of these atheists tend to believe that absent religion, that people are just going to be kumbaya, happy, joyous, and that all the conflicts in the world are going to be gone without religion, because religion supposedly is the root cause of all evil. This ignores the underpinnings of, basic, political and cultural conflicts, essentially. You can't really chalk up all wars to religion, and to do so would to dismiss everything else that actually contributed to the war. So to me, what that points out is that they tend to think that humans are inherently good, but that religion somehow corrupts them. So that's where I kind of see his connection to humanism, essentially. But with this kind of attempt to globalize these atheists, I'm an atheist, I don't buy the shit that people like this say, but with the attempt of globalizing these atheist values, these humanistic universalists, secular humanists, that you see the bastardization of these values, which that these that these concepts are supposed to stand for. Like, we should not entertain the idea of human rights. To do so would actually bring further injustices. For example, as was previously indicated, rights are often premised with the idea of sovereignty. However, people make these arguments like that the use of the internet is a human right, or that healthcare is a human right. And this not only frees the concept of human rights away from the sovereign state in nations where there isn't a state, like South Sudan, or like many of the other nations where there just isn't a state, or it's just complete chaos. To tie it to markets, too, to tie it to globalized capitalism. Above all else, what you see with human rights is that we should not associate them with resources. And that's exactly what you do when you say that internet, which is tied to bandwidth, and it's tied to silicon production, happens. And I don't think that the markets should determine the value of human rights and the availability of those human rights, if human rights were to even be entertained at all. I mean, if we're going to say freedom of speech is a human right, fine, whatever. But you cannot expand that to the internet use, because the internet is inherently restricted by minerals and resources. And that's problematic, because they can be denied in times of scarcity, or when there's very little flow in terms of those resources, which is what we're seeing now. I mean, obviously, if you live in a lot of parts of the world where there's no internet, it's because of the lack of resources. But, yeah. Hopefully that makes sense anyways. What I would say is that you really can't globalize universal values like I talked about. One of my favorite Marxist philosophers is John Baudrillard, who basically, I'll read exactly what he said. Basically, he said, "Today it is a bottom-up, and it involves neutralization of values as the result of their proliferation and their endless disparity. And it is for human rights, for democracy, and etc., that expanded according to the law of the lowest common denominator, to a point of maximum entropy, the Xerox degree of value. In fact, the universal perishes with globalization. When the dynamic of the universal as transcendence as the ideal and as the utopia becomes a reality, it ceases to exist and transcends the ideal as a utopia. The globalization of exchange puts an end to the universality of values. It is a triumph of monothought over universal thought. What is globalized is first of all thought through the market, the promiscuity of exchange of anything and everything, the perpetual movement of money." So what he's saying here is that we're trying to kind of make values into a product to be packaged and sold, essentially. The universal itself, globalized, democracy, human rights, circulate in exactly the same way through the exact same channels as any global product like oil and capital. And that's exactly what we're seeing with this kind of global cosmopolitan humanist values, essentially. So, like what I said earlier with my conclusion, what I would suggest is that at the end of the day that we shouldn't ignore the atrocities taking place across the world, but rather we should address these issues head on, and not try to claim some sort of sense of moral superiority. Because as I said earlier, we often dismiss the same mistakes that we're making with our own people and within nations that we occupy when we try to make these kind of hegemonic value claims. Thank you. Feel free to respond.